Hello and welcome to our module on storytelling for advocacy. In this module, we hope to convey the significance of storytelling and advocacy work, as well as provide information on constructing and framing a compelling personal narrative that supports each of us in telling our stories in a way that spurs action among those who hear us tell them. To begin this module, we first want to invite you to take just a moment to pause and consider what you think of when you hear the words stories and storytelling. And for some, it might be parables about life and its many lessons that get passed on orally through the generations. For others, it might be more fantastical thoughts and images that pop into your head, like with fairy tales that involve slaying dragons or epic voyages. And others yet may think of found stories, like uncovering hieroglyphics or finding journals that comprise time capsules illuminating past eras in our history. And while there is a great range of really unique responses that may come to mind, I would guess that each of us has connected with what stories and storytelling mean to us, likely based on how story has shaped each of us throughout our lives. And that's because ultimately stories are universal to us as humans. Our brains are wired to remember, experience, and connect with stories. And it's through story that we explore ourselves and the world around us such that we learn about and develop our own beliefs, values, and identities, which allows us to make principled choices in alignment with those aspects of ourselves as individuals, as communities, as nations, and as a larger world. And we're all storytellers each day with our loved ones, our colleagues, and others we encounter. So it's really a natural fit to bring that mutual quality to our advocacy efforts too. And it's precisely because stories are so powerful and universal that storytelling is considered one of the longest enduring and most effective tools to effect change. And the research tells us that narrative and storytelling approaches to policy dissemination are more effective than approaches that are exclusively data-focused. And we do talk a bit about using data effectively in your advocacy efforts in other modules. And we believe it's important information because at the end of the day, there are many people who can tell a convincing story that pulls on one's heartstrings. But to loosen the purse strings, whether it's support for your cause or literal funding to support your legislative initiatives, it really takes a compelling story and relevant data behind it to motivate folks to act. So while we only go and really scratch the surface of the data piece in this module, there is a module that goes more deeply into conveying evidence that you can refer to as well as you move through this module. And we would encourage you to consider where you can strengthen your evidence-informed case using storytelling if you've already watched that module. So putting all the pieces together. Additionally, in thinking about storytelling through a trauma-informed lens in particular, providing avenues for people and communities who have been impacted by trauma, using storytelling to invoke a voice of resistance to injustice, for them to claim their right to have a say about what happens in their lives, and for people with lived experience to speak truth to power to bring about social change, honors their lived experience as a source of wisdom and important information. And this creates the context and conditions for feelings of empowerment and self-efficacy to emerge. And those qualities, by the way, are linked to post-traumatic growth, as well as the restoration of a sense of hope and possibility among the peers of those who tell us similar stories. So providing a platform for the voluntary sharing of a substantial number of these stories really has the power to convey structural and institutional vulnerability and trauma, yet strength and resiliency embedded in the personal experiences and creative solutions that folks have devised to survive in the face of collective structural and institutional problems. So there are benefits abound to mastering the art of storytelling in trauma-informed advocacy work. So With that context, digging a bit deeper into some considerations about what the evidence tells us makes stories so powerful in advocacy work, which we hope is helpful to consider as you determine how you'd like to tell your own story, are featured on this slide. And so first, as mentioned earlier, stories are already how we as humans largely do learning, so to speak. And stories can also vividly answer the question of why your advocacy target ought to care, why this work matters, why your audience ought to value this solution that we're proposing above other potential options, and why the pathway to achieving that goal that we propose makes sense to achieve. Also helps achieve goals that are related to implementing the solution that we are asking people to coalesce around. Stories can also illuminate our shared values and help us join and take action to enliven and achieve our mutual best hopes together. The commonalities found in our stories can point at once to collective struggle, as well as collective paths to healing, liberation, and growth that align with our advocacy agenda. Stories also are effective to really cut through the noise of the many competing demands that proposed solutions out there have by giving voice to and enhanced power to a specific narrative that can help folks see things through a new lens. Happens to be our lens. And there are many issues and concerns that folks are focused on when it comes to solving seemingly intractable issues like preventing and healing trauma, especially as we collectively continue to navigate a highly unpredictable and stressful time, right? And so harnessing the power of compelling storytelling can help groups of people feel connected and coalesce around a particular solution of the very many options that are out there to solve some of these issues that everybody is very aware of as existing in our communities, but might not necessarily immediately connect to trauma and adversity. Finally, stories help us engage both the head and the heart. And if we were prompted to explain the reasons that each of us arrived at this advocacy work, for example, I'm not a betting person, but I would wager a guess that the most of us probably wouldn't rattle off facts or a list of statistics as the focus, right? That may very well be a part of the story we tell, sure, and we're more likely to share that we're here because of our desire to make change in alignment with our values, like the capacity to heal, fairness, resilience, equity, preventing harm, and other core beliefs that really drive us in this work. So at the end of the day, for better or for worse, emotions generally drive behavior more than logic does. And so really authentically invoking empathy in our stories can enhance our power to change hearts and minds, including facilitating working across difference and disagreement in a way that contributes to the advancement of our overall advocacy agenda. And so building on these considerations that really do attempt to help demonstrate why storytelling is a powerful advocacy tool, let's explore how storytelling inspires action by overcoming barriers that often emerge for those of us doing the policy advocacy work, which you see in the right-hand column of this schematic on the slide. And so a major reason that the status quo remains the status quo is because change at the structural and institutional levels can feel threatening to those who already maintain high levels of power, which means that advocating for major change can be met with resistance and ambivalence. So we invite you to consider the aspects of needing to break through also the inertia or the unwillingness to join to advocate for change, as well as the apathy, the fear, the isolation, and the self-doubt that all can contribute to folks rationalizing inaction. And we explore some factors related to these action inhibitors, as you see them called on this slide in other modules from this series. So they will probably seem somewhat familiar to you if you've moved through some of our other modules. But in terms of this slide, just a high-level overview, to inspire people to act. One feeling I imagine most of us that do this work are familiar with is the tension of noticing a contradiction between where the world is and where we wish it was or believe it ought to be. And we can use that emotional tension here to create a context of empowerment toward action. And the action motivators shown on the left part of the slide describe the emotions that research suggests help to negate the feelings that tend to inhibit action that you see on the right side of this slide. And it's important to consider then how we can overcome these barriers by mobilizing urgency and anger and hope and solidarity and self-efficacy, which is what that YCMAD alludes to, FYI, that is, you can make a difference through being, and we can do that through being really intentional about how we tell our stories. And so in the context that we're talking about today, we know that stories are most effective when they're engaging and connective, so they gain and retain the attention and interest of our target audience, as well as we discussed this at a high level in a bit, and we also do have a bit more in-depth module on this that you can view in our advocacy series if you're so inclined. Just as a comment here, a key to fostering that connection is to use alignment with your target audience's fundamental beliefs to really influence those more malleable beliefs in favor of your proposed solution. So where there's commonality on core beliefs, leveraging that to get your foot in the door when there are shakier, maybe less steadfast beliefs that you might be able to get people to move to your solution and your framework for with an effective story. Also crucial is that your storytelling is factual, authentic, and honest. Ultimately, lying or fabricating or even taking someone else's story and claiming it as your own or using it as if it's your own can damage your larger advocacy efforts and cause harm to communities and groups that you may actually intend to support. Unintentional harm is still harm. It is still hurtful. And we'll talk about how to anchor your story in relevant, evocative evidence more specifically in a bit as well, so stay tuned for that. We also want to mention that professional communication, which is certainly prudent to think about in terms of legislative advocacy and advancing your advocacy work and telling your story, professional doesn't necessarily indicate academic communication, right? And we explore again this in greater depth in other modules. But really what is important to know here is that translating evidence such that it is accessible rather than convoluted, concrete rather than abstract, and understandable rather than highly technical or academic will really serve you well in this context. And what sounds and looks like, what that sounds and looks like will certainly differ based on your target audience, but as a general rule, keeping language clear, simple, heartfelt, and jargon-free can make it easier for folks to connect with and relate to the happenings of your story. Ira Glass does this great. If you aren't familiar, he is a prolific radio broadcast personality on NPR, and he has famously said that everything is more compelling when you talk like a human being, when you talk like yourself. And that's solid advice in our experience too, so just want to lift that up. On a similar note, keeping things succinct yet impactful is another important consideration. Most folks that you'll be speaking to, like so many of us, are busy, and they may be mired in by any number of other internal or external competing demands for their attention. So timing does matter a bit here. And when working with policymakers, it's also important that your story is framed around salient policy issues, which sometimes differs a bit from how we may talk about or make meaning of information when we come from discussing it in other contexts and circles we might be involved with. We are all presenting pragmatic policy solutions to pervasive problems that require much more work than simply changing policy alone, since that's really often only the first step toward achieving the future we hope to see. And We also know that the policy landscape often provides the conditions and context through which other efforts are able to come to fruition. So continuing to advocate for funding and support for changes in alignment with addressing issues of chronic stress and adversity and trauma experienced along the life course at all levels that's related to policy formation, implementation, and sustainability. All of that is a useful guiding star to keep in mind as you construct your personal narrative. You know, how is this a policy solution when you're in front of a policymaker? Tying your story to a hero rather than a villain can really help you keep anchored in a solution-focused rather than problem-focused approach, which really aligns nicely with trauma-informed advocacy. And especially within the framework we will explore in this module, it invites your target audience to conceive themselves as the hero, which brings us to the last bullet point on this slide, indicating that storytelling is an effective political tool when it evokes participation from the audience. So presenting a call to action so your advocacy targets know what's expected of them and how they can make a difference is powerful in advancing your agenda. And this can really be anything depending on your role, your goal, and your audience when you're telling your story. And by the way, in the context of this module, your audience can go beyond policymakers, perhaps to grow your coalition or generate more momentum in your community toward your solution. So that means the call to action could be donating or volunteering or raising awareness or having further conversation or even just being willing to receive additional information via email or something similar. Holding a hearing or a meeting to get other stakeholders and decision makers on board. Asking a legislator to support a specific policy proposal if you are advocating and telling your story to a legislator. So many different options for that ask, that action step. But whatever it is, be sure you make the ask and consider how to connect your story to a good ask that makes sense for you based on your target audience and what you're looking for in advancing your advocacy agenda. So now let's break down some prep work that you may want to consider to inform your storytelling efforts before we go into this great framework to help you string together a coherent advocacy narrative. If you don't yet have an advocacy target, it can be helpful to consider actions already underway and resources already in place to define who you might want to speak with about advancing your proposed solution. And this process also involves getting a sense of who is already enthusiastically supporting and maybe even already doing some of this work, along with those who have passively expressed support or interest. And when it comes to the former group, connecting with people that you know are already champions or potential champions, like, wow, what an opportunity to grow your movement, right? And so in telling your story, it's useful to use that knowledge and employ it, whatever you gleaned being able to conduct research. You can use that to appeal to the audience that you select. And you can do that for non-champions as well, and it's important to do that in those cases. And we'll speak to about that in greater depth. It also helps to understand those who may oppose your ideas so you can anticipate their arguments and frame your story to focus on alignment and common ground rather than difference. Because there's evidence that suggests that stories can make us less defensive and more open to new ways of thinking. Really considering oppositional arguments can actually really help you strategize around changing hearts and minds, and it is possible. We've seen it happen. And there are many considerations on this slide for selecting a target that, again, we go into more deeply in other modules. And regardless of who your advocacy target ultimately is, it's important to consider what you really hope to accomplish with each one and to think about how to frame your story based on what you know about them. And some of this might be contingent upon what you envision your advocacy role being too, right? So you might, for instance, believe that you're well positioned to ask leaders of a large grassroots group with similar goals or values to your own advocacy agenda to invite their members to join an event that you're organizing. Or you might be looking at working with local government authorities to ensure aligned policy changes that are already underway are implemented sustainably through a trauma-informed lens. Or maybe you decide you want to meet with your legislators and their staff to encourage them to be a champion for your policy agenda and to use their positioning to get other lawmakers on board to increase momentum and support for the issue and your proposed solution within the structures of government itself. The avenues, as you can see, are many, and as you take a look at what's already happening and consider what changes you want to see and how you want them to come about, you'll likely find it easier to identify the best advocacy targets and form a coherent narrative to help you advance support of your vision of a preferred future. And once you've selected your advocacy target or targets based on what you're noticing is already happening in a more general sense, digging a little deeper to really get to know your targets will be a huge help in crafting your story. A good starting point is to seek out information about what is important to them so you can attune yourself to what they already value and find points of alignment. This slide has some considerations to help you get a sense of what might be helpful information to shape your storytelling as well in that context. So, for instance, if you can find information on things like how often your chosen audience has written or supported propositions that relate to topics that are relevant to addressing, healing, and preventing trauma, along with anything you can glean about what experiences have shaped their journey to being in the change-making role that they're in, you can really get a sense of what motivates them and what they already value. And as mentioned before, storytelling can be used to profoundly reinforce the perspective that your audience has, or alternatively, storytelling can help you get someone to step outside of themselves and consider a new perspective. So lots of power in really knowing your audience. And sometimes you might find that for your target audience, it isn't necessarily who is the most appropriate messenger of a story that you believe needs to be told. It might not be your story to tell. Consider who they might need to hear it from in order to be swayed and in order to model the model of being a trauma-informed advocate. Another aspect of this last bullet point to consider is that when you're sharing a story, when you're looking to share a story rather, that is not necessarily yours to tell in the first place, you can still bolster your message by uplifting and amplifying voices of lived experience. And that's a great way to engage in trauma-informed advocacy as well. If you yourself are a seasoned advocate, you may be even able to take on the role of coach or mentor, perhaps sharing the framework even that we're going to explore together in this module today to help folks in constructing their own coherent narrative to contribute to the change in a meaningful way. There are so many possibilities about the role you can play. So just encouraging you to think about, A, are you the person that your target audience is prone to listen to? And B, is this your story to tell, or alternatively, are there ways that you can uplift this story from someone who understands and consents to that by allowing them to tell it themselves, by making the connections? Lots of possibilities there. And at the end of the day, growing this movement is about more than just enumerating facts, right? It's and how you tell your story to reach a broader audience to advance trauma-informed change is as important as the details that make up the story itself. So let's talk a bit about a useful framework to engage and inspire others to act. The sequence you see on this slide, challenge, choice, and outcome, describes the structure of a story through the framework that we're about to explore together. And the story begins with a challenge to the status quo. That's generally something that is unexpected or unknown. This part of the story is something that resonates with us all because we each have some level of familiarity with the experience of having to make a choice when confronting the unknown. And so making a good choice in these tense and uncertain circumstances where this incongruity exists between the world as it is and the world that we want, we really have to disrupt the status quo and get the world in order, the world to think differently in order to act in alignment with our values. This is what it means, in essence, to be an agent of change in our advocacy work, as you might have heard. And the choice we make yields an outcome, which is essentially what we have all learned, or the meaning and moral of the story we're telling. And because we can frame the story in a way that generates emotional resonance, our audience can empathically identify with the protagonist in this story, not only hearing about someone else's courageous choice made in the face of a challenge, but also leaving them inspired to act themselves. And this is where those action motivators mentioned before come in to really spur change. The story encourages audience members to consider their own core values and how each of us, when confronted with a challenge, has the power to actively choose hope over fear, to choose solidarity over isolation and alienation, and to choose to make a difference and to choose self-efficacy over self-doubt and become an agent of change. I want to lift up that the information on this framework is excerpted from the work of Marshall Ganz from the Harvard Kennedy School of Government. Among other contributions, he played an instrumental role in shaping Barack Obama's successful grassroots organizing model, rooted in this public narrative framework, which I was first fortunate enough to learn about at a training with the Congressional Research Institute for Social Work and Policy that I was involved in for a political boot camp and media training many years ago. And I and other advocates have found this to be just an incredibly useful framework to aid in the development of a coherent narrative to use in advocacy work. And so I'm excited to share it with you today. Before getting into the details of this model, though, I want to uplift that it's important to recognize that your story is your story, and no one knows your story better than you. This is not about changing any of the key details of your story. It's about framing your authentic, true story immersively to have the greatest advocacy impact based on what we've discussed thus far related to what is known about impactful storytelling in an advocacy context. So, in short, this framework integrates the choice, challenge, change structure on the last slide to help you, as the storyteller and expert of yourself, convey the values that called you to this work, the values that unite us all in action, and the urgent challenges to those values that we must join together to overcome. At a high level, the story of self involves you describing events, challenges, and choices that led you to act. Each of us has a unique journey of really learning how to be a full human being who acts in alignment with our values, and being judicious about what we include in our story based on what we've learned about our target audience and what they value can enhance their motivation to take action toward change when we appeal to that journey. Maybe there is a lot of overlap in what brought you to the work and experiences of your advocacy target that they've spoken about publicly, or what they've supported in the past. You can connect around that using story. Some considerations here on this slide encourage you to really reflect on aspects of your own advocacy journey, like when did you first feel like you had to do something? What are the reasons you felt like you could do something? How did you get the courage and hope to act? The story of self is really shaped around choice points during those moments in our lives where, in the face of uncertainty and challenge, we must choose how to act in alignment with our beliefs. And in this part of the story, we are modeling to policymakers and society at large that we each can contribute to bringing about meaningful change. We each have a role to play in this story. The story of us captures the shared values, experiences, and capacities of folks joining together to work toward change. The us here will change depending on your target audience, certainly. So for instance, if you're working to get people with lived experience involved to grow your efforts in the community, the us will likely represent the community on which the action is focused, and the choices and challenges that shape this part of the story are the ones that the community has faced. If the us is policymakers, centering on those shared values that unite you in overarching policy goals may be the way that you choose to go. And if you're a constituent, enlisting their commitment to you as your representative is a great way to illuminate the clear role that they could play in making an impact, because then the us is the community that you both are members of. The goal of this part of the story is, again, to really create this sense of unity, togetherness, and focus on the shared values of your listeners, whoever they may be. And so highlighting those specific choice points where people are already coming together to shape our world in a trauma-informed way, that will resonate with audience members. And that involves maybe highlighting those shared values, describing the challenges, and also uplifting moments of success and resilience. It's important to honor and acknowledge the progress that you're already building on, that is already underway as well. And finally, the story of now outlines the current challenges that your audience faces in a way that presents a vision for change and a potential outcome that is within reach if and only if your advocacy target joins your efforts. And so a part of this is highlighting the urgency of the situation. Going back to that action motivator slide, that essentially means demonstrating how the world out there is not as it should be based on our deeply held shared values. This means we're at a choice point. And so summoning our audience to make a choice to take concrete actions and next steps to bring about change comes with you framing the story in an effective way around those action motivators and making the ask based on the urgency of the here and now. And so in sum, this framework taken together is basically, here's the challenge, here's how I'm involved, here's how our community members and others are impacted, here's why it's relevant to you, and here's a solution for action grounded in a realistic sense of hope to make a meaningful impact with your help. By weaving together the stories of self, us, and now, building into each of these stories a challenge, choice, and outcome, you can construct a compelling and inspirational narrative in which your targets can begin to see themselves as the hero characters in this story, which, as mentioned a bit earlier, ultimately can move them to act. We also want to mention that your story may evolve over time, and that in our experience, it can be great to have a core story that can be applied sort of across the board with space to make additions and changes as needed. And in the current context of the here and now, new needs are emerging each moment and evolving, right? And existing needs are compounding, and new understandings about what helps and what hurts are being developed, and policy priorities are ever shifting, and research is advancing, and, right? It continues on. And so as the story of now shifts, so too may your framing of the challenge, choice, and outcome in the stories of self and us. We're providing some exercises and further reading in the resources and that accompany this series on our website that we hope help you in thinking about applying what we've covered in this module in your advocacy and maybe practicing writing down some of these points and putting your story together through this framework. Whether you pursue the worksheets, the activities, the informational resources, or you don't, we would invite you to take a final moment to pause and reflect upon what in this module resonated with you and what you might consider integrating into how you tell your story the next time you're in a position to engage others in action toward change, along with perhaps what opportunities you might have to customize your story to the particular audiences that you plan to target. We so appreciate your thoughtful reflection here, as we at CTIP fervently believe that making your story memorable and collaborating to amplify voices and stories of lived experience that are yearning to be heard is vital in moving the needle of public opinion and public policy toward a more compassionate, equitable, trauma-informed, and healing-centered world. We've found collaborative strategies where groups of purpose-driven individuals and organizations come together get so much more accomplished with less effort than folks working alone. And you can be a driving force in building that energy and momentum by harnessing and amplifying the unique and various and varied expertise found within compelling narratives from diverse voices, as well as by engaging in effective storytelling yourself, whether it's to a policymaker or someone in the community that you think might find value in joining your larger advocacy efforts. Each of us, again, has a role to play in advancing change. And it is our best hope at CTIP that you emerge from this module with some great ideas of how and where your voice is needed to advance meaningful and sustainable change, as well as how you'll tell your story to do just that.